Brianne Showman, Get Your Fix Physical Therapy and Performance. Today, we're talking about shin splints, specifically the causes of shin splints, which I will say there's a lot more than you probably think. And that's the reason that there's not just that one quick fix for shin splints. Like, you talk to a number of people and they'll give you who knows how many different suggestions. It's ultimately because different things work for different people because different people have different causes of their shin splints. So, unfortunately, newsflash, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution for shin splints. But we'll dive into the causes today so you can at least start figuring out what's going on for yourself. Now, when we're talking shin splints, I also need to say there are, just look at my notes here, there are two, depending on who you talk to, like we'll hear shin splints as different terms. Ultimately, I'm going to say there's two different places they can happen essentially. So we have our anterior shin splints, which involves our anterior tibialis muscle, which is the one right on the front of the shin. And then we can have what we call medial shin splints, which are a little bit more towards like the big toe side of that foot. Like almost feels like it's right alongside the inside of that bone there. Now, just to clear it up real quick, we always want to make sure there's no stress fracture going on, especially if it's medial because it can be some tenderness on that bone. So with shin splints, we always want to double check, make sure there's no stress fractures going on before we do anything, because if there's something there, that definitely changes your plan of care and what you want to do going forward, taking care of this. But assuming there's none of that, we're looking at shin splints. So on those anterior shin splints, we're talking about that anterior tibialis muscle, basically that big muscle that lifts your foot up. When we're talking about medial shin splints, typically we're talking about your posterior tibialis. So the anterior tibialis is the one that lifts your foot up. The posterior tibialis, nope, doesn't point your toe. Just, that'd be too easy, right? What it does though is it gives you a stable big toe to stand on when you are on a single leg on your toe. So every time you push off when you're running, that post tib is firing. Fun little fact, I know. So, being that these have two different functions, they absolutely are going to have different causes, and there's some causes you aren't expecting as well. Now, causes can absolutely be weakness. Like if you ramped up your mileage really, really fast and those muscles haven't had time to adjust to it, weakness could absolutely be a factor here. Most often, it's not the factor though. So what are we looking at? When we're talking anterior, a lot of times we're looking at someone who heel strikes really hard. When you heel strike hard, there's a lot of force going up through that leg. There is a lot of control that needs to happen to let that foot lower to the ground or get yourself controlled to the ground. So that muscle has to work really hard. There's a lot of strain going through that muscle. So heel striking and that really hard force can contribute to a lot of shin splints. When we're talking the posterior tib, yes, weakness is a big one there as well, because we're going onto the toe. One thing we want to look at though is how are you coming off the ground? Are you springing off the ground, giving yourself a lot of vertical displacement, really using that toe hard? Or are you using your hamstring to pull your leg off the ground so it's coming off really easy? So all it has to do is necessarily support your weight. It doesn't have to propel you anywhere. So that can be another thing with this. The other thing that is often not thought about is there's a lot of interplay between the foot and ankle and the hip. Yes, they're on opposite ends of your leg, but there's a huge correlation here. When our hip muscles are really tight, our foot can't fire as well. So I've seen both personally and myself personally, as well as with people I've worked with, a lot of weakness, quote unquote weakness, in that post tib because the muscles in the hip are tight, specifically like glute medius, glute minimus, get tight. So those muscles can't fire as well in the foot. So that is something to think about or consider, is how tight is that hip, and what's going, and how could that be contributing to the shin issue. And then the other thing that I always look at is just range of motion in that hip. Has it gotten loosened up? Is it ready to run? A lot of times, like, especially with, like, our hips get really tight because we sit a lot, we're in one place a lot of the time, or we simply don't do any sort of warm up before we go run. We just go run. So sometimes, just because our hips are tight, they aren't real loose, there's not real mobile, it changes how the whole leg has to work in general when we're running. So sometimes if we loosen up that hip, do a dynamic warm up, that can help resolve shin splints easily as well. So I have seen that a number of times. So it's something to consider there. And even if that doesn't work, never hurts to do a dynamic warm up before you go, right? So lots of stuff on shin splints here today. If you have any of the, feel free to search my channel for any other information you might be looking for. You can also check my website out, getyourfixpt.com. And on that website, you can also find ways to contact me if you have any specific questions about yourself or want some further help. So have an awesome day. Talk to you again.